Hello and welcome. Heroes come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. But when we're talking about the heroes of the faith, there are two aspects that are always found. They believe in God and they do what he says. Notice what James says in James 2, verses 19 and 20. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? You see, we have to believe in God, but that's not enough on its own. We then have to do what he says. We have to live faithfully. And this is what we read of with our hero of the faith today. And we're going to be looking at Esther. There's a book named after Esther. She lived at the end of the Babylonian period. She was a Jew living in Babylon, and she rose to be queen. Now, her uncle Mordecai, who was a noble Jewish man, had raised her. She was an orphan, and she was extremely beautiful. Well, it came about that the king of that time, King Ahasuerus, had a huge feast in which, towards the end of it, he ordered his wife, Queen Vashti, to come and parade herself in front of all the guests. Well, she refused. A bad move there. The king was so enraged that he ordered that he was going to divorce his wife, not only as a lesson to Vashti, but also a lesson to all the women of the kingdom, that they should obey their husbands. Well, then, a message went out over all the land that all the most beautiful young women should be brought before the king so he could choose a new queen. And it came to Esther, who was chosen. And so she became the queen, and her uncle Mordecai was always there trying to help in any way that he could. Well, there was a wicked man in the kingdom named Haman, who despised Mordecai, all because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. And he convinced the king that he ought to have all the Jews put to death. Of course, this meant that Mordecai and Queen Esther would have to be put to death. So let us notice in the book of Esther, chapter 4, we read verses 1 through 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloths and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloths. And each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish. And she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, that he might remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept them. You see, Esther realized the great catastrophe that was about to befall them. But let's read on, down in verse 10. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and all the people of the king's province know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he will be put to death unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you are in the king's palace and can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. For such a time as this. Well, this steeled Esther. And she went into the king's presence, knowing that if he was displeased in any way, she would be put to death. There was a pause in the proceedings as the king looked at his queen and decided what to do. But then he raised his scepter to her, and she reached out and touched it, and she was saved from this immediate death. Well, she went on and explained to the king what was about to happen, and explained how it was Naaman, who hated Mordecai and the Jews, who was setting about this. It ended up Naaman and his family were killed, and the Jews were given a reprieve. All because this young woman, Esther, was faithful to God. You know, we're often put in positions that we have to stand up for God and His truths. And we feel frightened. We're worried about the consequences, what will happen to us. But you know, it may be for just such a time as this that we are placed where we are. We have to believe God and just continue to do what He asks us to do. We need to be faithful. And then maybe we too can be classified as one of the heroes of the faith. Thank you once again. Come back and join us again. We're continuing to do this every single week. Thank you and goodbye.